Good morning and welcome to the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce's Brazil Summit. I am John Welch, Executive Director of the Brazilian American Chamber, and on behalf of the Chamber, we wish you all a wonderful spring. Thank you for coming. We have the honor of hosting the newly appointed Chief Representative Foreign Office of the Ministry of the Economy of Brazil in Washington, D.C., Dr. Carlos da Costa.
The first thing we needed to do to transform our country was to guarantee fiscal stability. So without fiscal stability, no country can prosper because there is no price stability, there's no predictability, and this is very important for anybody who invests, not only foreign investors, but also domestic investors. They need stability, they need predictability. The second thing was to introduce a sequence of reforms to improve the business environment, regulatory reforms, market reforms towards competition in such a way that we could unleash the private sector energy, the talent and resources towards production, and support startups and small and medium enterprises where most of the growth and of the employment is created. We implemented a hiring freeze, and at the same time, we knew that around half of the public servants would retire within 6 years. So a hiring freeze, not a 100% hiring freeze. It was a replacement rate of 25% hiring freeze. In other words, every 4 employees who retired, we had the plan of not hiring more than 1. That would slowly decrease the amount of civil servants. And at the same time, through digitization and more efficiency in our public processes, we would guarantee the quality of the services to the population. And indeed, the replacement rate has been 21% in these 3 years, and the quality of the services as evaluated by our population has improved. And right now, we are the 7th most digitized government in the world. Pensions reform, you can see in the bottom graph, the dotted line is what would have happened if we hadn't done the pension reform. And the solid line is what is occurring. We can already see the fiscal impact of the pension reform. Pension reforms generally take many, many years to produce all the impact in the economy and the impact on the budget, but we are already seeing a fiscal impact of the pension reform. And because of that, the primary result of the central government, which was almost 2% of the GDP as in a deficit, it was improving before the pandemic. Of course, it worsened during the pandemic, 10% of the GDP as a deficit, as many other countries, as it occurred in many other countries. The median was 10% of the GDP internationally for large economies. But it came back very fast. This is what impressed many people, how we, in the first year after the pandemic, in fact, it wasn't not exactly after the pandemic, because during 2021, we still had the impact of the pandemic. But we already had almost a budget balance for federal government. In the doing business ranking, for instance, which has been discontinued by the World Bank, but still has no other measure that took its place. We were number 124 at the beginning of the government. That was a shameful position for our country. How come we were the number 124th worst paid place to do business? This was unacceptable. Our president said we need to be in the top 50 in the first month of government. When he went to Davos, he introduced this target for us. So we got together and we sat together in government under the leadership of our president, and we started implementing several measures to improve our business environment, as I mentioned before. But here in this graph, we see the impact of them in what would be the doing business ranking if it had been if it were still calculated. For private infrastructure, the second largest cause of custo Brazil, we have implemented several laws which have unleashed private investment. For instance, railroad laws that we have enacted this year has unleashed around $20 billion in investment in the next years. $20 billion, which has been unleashed without government spending 1 cent, only by removing the obstacles that were there preventing the private sector to invest in railroads. The same thing with cabotage. The US is still discussing the Jones Law. We have changed the cabotage law in Brazil. We have modernized to open our seas to foreign providers and then reduce the cost of doing business. The PPP's law, sanitation law, telecom law, we're still working to implement the electric sector law this year, which brings a yearly investment of $21 billion in Brazil. Our plan for the next years is to increase with more than 70% coming from renewable energy. We have the opportunity to feed the world. We are already doing that, especially in this moment that we are now. Oil, gas, and chemicals with pre-salt and natural gas, the new natural gas legal framework. We have freed the markets. We are facing a booming startups. 70% of startups investment in Latin America today is in Brazil. A booming logistics and infrastructure with all the reforms that I mentioned. Brazil is the third fastest digitizing country in the world, so many opportunities in digitalization. Clean and cheap energy for energy intensive industries like glass, ceramics, aluminum, and so on. Industry 4.0, Brazil is undergoing a very fast technology transformation in our manufacturing sector with advanced manufacturing. We have the greenest fleet of autos in the world with this combination of ethanol, gas, and electric vehicles. Remembering that ethanol has zero carbon footprint because whatever ethanol emits in the auto is what the sugarcane absorbs.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for a wonderful and enlightening presentation. Okay, so now we're going to turn to the Brazil Economic and Political Outlook panel.
There has been particular progress in Brazil on the policy front, particularly on the regulatory area. This is often overlooked, and the progress in the privatization program continues. So that is really a welcome sight. But what hasn't happened, as he acknowledged, is the deeper reforms. So the question that always comes to mind is, if you have some micro progress, and of course, Sao Paulo is a booming entrepreneurial global center, if you have progress on the micro front, without the macro support, without the bigger reforms, can you really achieve sustainable higher growth?
And I think that's the first thing when we talk about inflation, and John already touched in some of these points, but we have to recognize it is a global phenomenon that was driven, and at least initially, mainly by an enormous amount of shock in the last couple of years that disrupted supply chains and also boosted demand, especially for goods when people were not allowed to consume services during the peak of the pandemic. And that's the inflationary process from the shocks gained traction on the back of all the policy stimuli around the globe, especially since 2020, all the fiscal, monetary policy, liquidities, and so on. So, and that's why JP Morgan economists, we do expect global inflation to reach at 6.5% by the end of the second quarter this year. These are levels that we haven't seen for a long time. If you take just one look, March, and John just touched about that, but March global CPI on average, our estimation was about 1.2%. This is the highest number in record. I think that since World War II, and when we actually had some data, some countries we don't even have data back that long. But yet, Brazil is a notch higher than that. Inflation now at 11.3%, double digits since September last year. And despite the fact that Brazil Central Bank has already started to hike rates in a very aggressive mode, even for our own standards.
2020, for 2023, we're a little bit less constructive. We've got a growth forecast of 1.1% with negative risks. Again, we think that Brazil, with an interest rate at double digits, close to 13%, it's going to be very limiting on the ability for Brazil to grow much more than 1% for next year. When you look at the correlation between IPCA and oil prices, is quite strong, especially after 2018. So the one thing that we hear investors say about getting a little bit more optimistic on inflation in Brazil is look at the peak of oil prices. When it's going to start coming down, then inflation in Brazil is most likely going to start coming down as well. We assume that there's going to be some flexibilization of the spending cap. We believe that it's very restrictive and that beyond 2023, there's going to need to be some sort of adjustment there in the rule. We also expect that GDP for the long term approaches 2%, and also that real interest rates remains somewhat around 4% in real terms.
I will as you may know, we affirmed the rating at BA2 with a stable outlook just actually, I don't know, last week. So over the last, say, 5 years, Brazil's interest burden, as we measure it, interest revenue, has been coming down very significantly. So if you look at the peak, it was around 30%, that ratio, interest payment to revenue in 2015. It has come down to less than 15% last year. That's a big change in the fiscal dynamics and also in the fiscal effort required to stabilize that burden. So over the medium term, we do expect that ratio to remain slightly below or around 20% starting in 2024. It's still relatively high compared to peers, but it's manageable, I would say. It is something that we look at and has been on our radar. So this is a metric that we care about. If we look at the, if you will, 10 years from 2016, 17 to 2026 going forward, you have growth on average growth based on the forecast at less than 1% or barely around 1%. That is very low for Brazil. It's very low for an emerging market. It is something that I would say, if I have to put a puzzle together, it's still the missing piece in Brazil's credit profile that is kind of pulling lower the credit profile a bit. I wouldn't say even more than the fiscal. I would say today even more than the fiscal side, because we discussed a lot the fiscal, and there are mitigating factors that we see even in the current high debt level that support. But the growth piece is still missing.
I do not think this election is a done deal, but Lula is a clear favorite. Right now, we have Lula at around a 70% probability of taking this election. But I am fully of the view that this race will tighten. If you look at second round simulations, Lula leads by an average of about 15 percentage points from the president. That should narrow to about 6 to 7 points, or between 5 and 10 points. There are two kind of headlines for expectations for Lula government. Number one, I do think that he will assume office and will make let's say, moderate overtures to avoid a financial crisis of confidence early in his administration. This is a candidate who clearly will promise a lot more spending over the course of the campaign. This is Brazil's kind of social scar tissues coming out of the pandemic are significant, particularly with it on inflation. So there will be a debate to put a constitutional reform on the table to tweak, redraft, undo the spending cap. So whether it's a tweak to the spending cap or you implement a new rule, but I do think that that the first year will be characterized by altering the spending rule to accommodate more spending, particularly on social policy and investments, but with an eye and a care that this does not lead to a spiraling debt dynamic. And what that will probably come accompanied with is a tax reform, Part of it is a productivity reform to unify federal, state, and local taxes, but part of it with an eye to increase taxes to accommodate the more spending.
I just want to reiterate my thanks, and I thought we learned a lot. So thank you very much.
Now we do turn to our second keynote speaker, BNDES President Gustavo Montezano.
Is that Brazil has gone in a very, I would say, intense, unseen revolution on the way the country works. We have been moving from a centralized economy into a decentralized based economy. We've been based our infrastructure from 2005 to 2016 on very deep subsidized rates, where the federal banks were choosing the champions. And if you're not chosen to access a deep subsidized facility from BNDES or any other federal bank, you are basically out of the table. That makes Brazil be the size of BNDES. So everything that BNDES or the public banks could handle on their pillar, I would say, will be standing. Anything that doesn't fit or there was not enough space on the public banks pillar will be out of the table. And that has limited the growth of Brazil, because by basing your economy on a centralized decision-making model with deep subsidies, on top of the fiscals and on top of the reputational issues, you turn our infrastructure or our industry as a whole not innovative. So if you look at our infrastructure today, as of today in Brazil, for example, we are behind our peers on sophistication, on products, on decentralization. And when I say peers, you don't need to go far. If you go to Chile, Peru, Mexico, Colombia, they are far more sophisticated than we are in infrastructure. On the infrastructure market, we plan to keep our very successful project factory, where BNDES is today the largest project structure globally, according to Geologic. We are handling, from the last 2 years, and in the pipeline, roughly 160 projects with more than 350 billion reais of invested, planned investments on those projects. And working hand by hand with this project preparation, on the financing side, is to develop in Brazil the true project finance on limited recourse or non-recourse model. In Brazil, we didn't evolve on this. We basically have corporate finance for investments, and that's again that limits our innovation agenda on the financing for infrastructure. Going to the industrials or productive sector, everything that we do there is innovation and energy transition or sustainability, I would say. Helping our productive capital in Brazil to move towards the carbon neutral economy. Why are you doing that? Simply because for Brazil, this is a strong competitive advantage. So it's a global trend. Everyone needs to do that. Everyone's willing to do that. But if you compare Brazilian position against other emerging markets, we're very well positioned, because for us, given our I would say natural characteristics, it's a competitive advantage, either on the very high biodiversity and forest base that we have, or in our ability to generate sustainable energy and being the agro powerhouse of the world. Going to the SME, small and medium enterprises, which is our third pillar, we need to be much more present than we are there as a bank as of today. If you look at central bank data from Feb 2020 to Feb 2022, the total SME markets in Brazil grew more than 50% total balance, according to central bank. Basically because the government programs executed during the pandemic, especially the FDI PAC and the PRONAMP, they were very well succeeded. And that opens up a room for BNDES, which is a wholesale bank and should keep as a wholesale bank, in my view, could share risk at the last mile on the SME market through the guarantees or SBLC products. As of today, more than 20% of the total SME market passes on BNDES hands, either through on lending for the financial institutions or managing the federal funds for guarantee credit. And our fourth pillar is in the climate agenda, and that's a transversational topic for everything that we do here. Again, that's a huge competitive advantage for Brazil once the world is now pricing the cost of using climate as a raw material for any kind of production. So we have a lot of things to offer, either through biodiversity or forest or water or land, or through sustainable energy production. However, we need to learn. We need to learn how to price that. We need to learn how to trade that, and you need to learn how to account that. As a development bank, we are very well positioned to work as a catalyzer for this change in the green growth, in the green economy, not only in Brazil, but globally. And we do think that the carbon markets, either the regulated and voluntary, will be the key vehicle for that. And we do intend to be a massive player on this agenda. We put ourselves a challenge to be more present in the education agenda in Brazil. That's something that BNDES is not does not deeply know, as we know many other sectors in Brazil. However, if you're speaking about long-term GDP growth, long-term social development, and long-term environmental sustainability, education is a critical path for that. Thank you all. Have a nice day.
Very good. Thank you. Take care. Okay, our final attraction today is a panel on mergers and acquisitions.
We had a reduction in terms of number of deals around 15%, and in terms of volume, the decrease was even deeper, down 60%. These are geologic figures. And, in our view here, and we have seen this in the past when we reached high interest rates in Brazil during the Dilma government, it's a quite challenging time to close transactions, given that the cost of capital changes very fast. And then you have discussions over valuation of the companies.
Luciana, are there differences in different sectors that you're observing? I know that you specialize in particular sectors, so I'm curious about your views on that.
As I think that some sectors are still busier, right? And of course, there has been a decrease. Last year was a very busy year, right, for us here in the M&A industry. I think that the technology sectors, agro sector, education sectors are still very busy, at least from my perspective. And these are life science as well. These are sectors that are steady here in Brazil. We also see activities, small deals, big deals. And they are kind of a safe haven in all that's going on.
And the war in Europe, it definitely could be an opportunity for Brazil in the long run to attract better a long-term capital to the country. What we see right now is short-term capital flowing into the country. That has happened in the stock exchange, but it's very important that we start, bringing in a long-term capital for the country.
Maybe in 2010 to 2015, we saw a lot of cross-border transactions, big ones, very important ones. We don't see that now. We didn't see that last year. And I think, again, a combination of factors. First, I think there was so many opportunities in developed countries, like the wealth creation that you saw in the US in the last years, in more stable economies. I think that deviate the attention of investors and potential investors to Brazil to those more mature and stable markets. And also, I think it's part of that is our fault. I think at some points Brazil has become very complex to understand, and maybe that people were again cautious and less inclined to invest here.
In particular, when I think about the story that Brazil was able to tell in years past, it was a story of potential growth. Sort of come to Brazil, invest. There is this big middle class that's growing. There is all this potential and so on. And then I think what happened in the last couple of years in the US is that there is a lot of growth in tech. And so growth is easier to invest in tech in the US, right? And get that growth rather than the more problematic growth in Brazil. Having said that, and I'm looking at Luciana, there is a lot of tech in Brazil now. And there are a lot of opportunities for investments in tech in Brazil. So I wonder whether that's going to be sort of the spur for interest abroad into Brazil.
From my perspective, we have very innovative guys here. So we have, there are great ideas, great products that can actually internationalize and be used in Latin America or probably in the world. We see, and in that part, we see foreign funds investing big here and in the series of the Brazilian entities. What I think ends up happening, or at least at this point ends up happening, is that the companies at some point, they go abroad and they go public abroad, or they actually become foreign entities. They start local with great ideas and great people, they grow here. And there is a market that makes that possible. Also in terms of people, how many people we have, and it's cheap technology most of the times. And then they all go public abroad, and that generates some other legal issues for us. I don't, at least from my perspective, I'd love to hear Fabio on that. I don't see this link directly with our interest rates here and the tech industry.
Do you see any? We see like an important movement of like ESG concerns, and I think that's it's not a challenge, it's an opportunity in my view to Brazil for our market, to the extent that we somehow have literally all the resources to somehow to fit within ESG like standards. But it's still something that like started like for 2-3 years ago. We see that is no longer a trend, maybe it's a reality. Maybe starting with Fabio, on your clients, on the bank itself, how do you see ESG in the market getting importance, and the E and the S and the G, both three elements? How do you see that?
I think that governance and social, they're already perceived by companies as important themes, and the environmental aspect became more critical because of all the studies involving global warming and so on. So in the end of the day, you have today investors that are taking decisions based on ESG themes. They are investing in one company or selling their shares. We've seen what happened in Russia with many US companies and European companies closing their operations in the country and taking big losses in their balance sheets, but basically taking a decision of not acting in operating in a country that initiated a war. So I mean, in our case here at Vinci, we have a director that is responsible for. We have a business unit here of ESG, so it's as Fabio mentioned, definitely something. It's an area that all investors and companies are looking very deeply, and we understand it's quite important.
Thank you, Mauricio. Thank you, Pedro, Felipe, Fabio, and Luciana, for a really great panel. To close, I'd like to remind you all that our next event is the Person of the Year Gala. on Monday, the 9th of May. Looking forward to seeing you there. Again, thank you for all for coming, especially to our members. For those that are not, please watch the brief video that follows and consider joining the chamber. Until then, stay healthy and in good spirits.